There's been shocking news that the Chinese government is trying to rewrite the Quran in order to reflect their socialist values. This is just another step in the brutal oppression of our Uyghur brothers and sisters by the Chinese government. Allah mentions the attempt of past people to change His revelation. In Surah Al-Baqarah, Allah says, وَيْلٌ لِلَّذِينَ يَكْتُبُونَ الْكِتَابَ بِأَيْدِيهِمْ ثُمَّ يَقُولُونَ هَذَا مِنْ عِنْدِ اللَّهِ. Woe to those who write the book with their own hands and then claim this is from Allah. So this is something that we find throughout history. And in fact, there have been many attempts in the modern period to change the Quran. But rewriting the Quran is not an easy process. This is partly because Muslims memorize the Quran and are preserving the Quran in their hearts and minds. But there are other ways that a government can change and attempt to distort the teaching of the Quran. And there are 5 examples or strategies in history that I want to share with you so that we're aware of these kinds of attempts by governments. Number 1, make Arabic illegal. Make Arabic a language that Muslims are not familiar with. This is a strategy that was taken by Ataturk to secularize Turkey. This is a strategy that was taken by many of the dictatorial regimes within the Muslim world in the beginning of the colonial period, 200 or so years ago. By taking away knowledge of Arabic, you restrict people's understanding of the Quran and their ability to distinguish true teachings from false teachings. Part of this process was also making sure that Arabic teaching was taken out of school curricula, so that no longer are schools teaching Arabic to Muslim students. Without the Arabic language, an understanding of the Quran becomes impossible, and an understanding of the entire Islamic tradition becomes impossible. And this is exactly what governments who want to destroy Islam, or they want to distort Islam and manipulate the Muslim community, this is one of their primary tactics. Take away Arabic from the Muslims. The second main strategy is to shut down Quran schools. Make sure that the only places that are teaching Quran at an institutional level are controlled by the government. This is something that we also find within the past 200 years. The third strategy is to imprison any scholar who is not going to teach the government-approved message. This is very effective because you can limit authentic teaching of the Quran. And these kinds of governments and colonial powers, imperial powers, recognize that Islam and the Quran specifically is transmitted through authentic teaching. That is the primary way that the Quran passes from one generation to the next. So if you can manipulate this chain and cut off those individuals that are not going to follow the government's dictates, that's the best way to rewrite the Quran and manipulate Muslim understanding of the Quran. And you can call those scholars extremists, you can call those scholars terrorists, you can call those scholars all kinds of things to discredit them and put them in prison because they're not going to teach the way that you want them to teach as a dictator or a governmental regime. The fourth method is that you can promote ignorant scholars. You can promote scholars who are going to be willing to compromise and scholars who are going to be willing to hide parts of the Quran that are going to disagree with what the government wants to push. And Allah again mentions this in the Quran when He says, إِنَّ الَّذِينَ يَكْتُمُونَ مَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ مِنَ الْكِتَابِ. Those who conceal from what Allah has sent of the book. This is a strategy. Teach part of the book, conceal part of the book. That way, you can make sure that what is taught of the Quran and what Muslims practice conforms to your agenda and to your ideological goals. These teachers are going to be promoted within universities. They're going to be promoted on TV, on social media. They're going to be given prominent, high-ranking positions within governmental administrations. They're going to be serving in official capacities as scholars and muftis and professors and so forth. This is a way that the government can make sure that their agenda is being taught and represented, whereas anyone who is not going to be bought, anyone who is not going to be pushing that kind of agenda will be imprisoned, like I said, will be labeled all kinds of things, tarred and feathered and smeared, and that is how you get rid of any kind of ideological opposition in the teaching of Islam. And the fifth method for distorting the Quran and distorting its teachings is to spread mistranslations of the Quran. This is also effective because if you control the publishing houses, you can make sure that the only translations that get put out are translations that affirm your governmental agenda. And even within the West, you can see this. There have been feminist translations of the Quran in English. You have perennialist translations of the Quran, where you have this message that all religions are true and there's not one single religion that Allah has accepted, namely Islam. You have those kinds of translations that are pushed and promoted within universities and so forth. So this is a way to change the Quran without actually rewriting the actual words that Muslims have memorized. These are the 5 methods in which this can happen. What we have to recognize is that this is not something that's just happening in China. This is something that has been happening throughout the Muslim world and even in the West, in America and Europe. These are the kinds of strategies that are undertaken in more or less subtle ways. Sometimes it's not going to be overt. Sometimes it's not going to be very obvious, like in the case of China, where they just announce that they're doing this kind of project. Sometimes it's much more subtle in, for example, as I mentioned, promoting certain scholars, demoting and smearing certain scholars, shutting down schools, pushing different translations. All these methods are more subtle and therefore less likely to arouse the anger of Muslims who want to protect the Quran from this kind of interference. But we know at the end of the day, Allah will preserve the Quran as He's promised us, and we have to do our part by making sure that we don't fall for these kinds of tricks and we resist these kinds of manipulation of the pure message of the Quran. We ask Allah to firmly establish the Quran in our hearts and give us the tawfiq to act by it and to live by its teachings. Ameen. Assalamu alaikum, guys. If you enjoyed this video and you appreciate this kind of thinking about Islam and modernity, then I highly encourage you to enroll at Al-Lesna Institute. We have courses that will teach you how to think about these issues and how to critique modernity and these ideologies in order for you to strengthen your faith in Islam and fight the kinds of doubts that paralyze Muslims in the modern world. Enroll today.